What happens when Russian soldiers return from Ukraine? The truth is darker than you think. My name is Elvira Bary, and I am an author born in the USSR. On this channel, we delve deep into Russia's past, present, and future, uncovering uncomfortable truths without sugarcoating anything. To understand the fate awaiting Russia's returning soldiers, we need to examine the realities faced by the military, the civilians, and the country's leadership. The army in Russia is not a political entity and does not make decisions. At least that's been the case since the end of World War II. There is a huge disconnect between the active officers and the bureaucrats who set the strategic goals. Ministry of Defense officials receive directives from the president and, as best as they can, pass them down to the army. But they are convinced that the army is just a collection of drunks and failures who could not find success in civilian life. Charismatic leaders are not tolerated in the Russian army, as they could turn the military into a political force. Such generals might inspire soldiers to challenge corrupt officials, since the soldiers would likely follow them into battle. As a result, these types of officers are either not promoted or swiftly neutralized once they start questioning the system. A prime example is Major General Ivan Popov, who dared to speak out in defense of his soldiers and paid the price with his freedom. His story is both powerful and revealing. If you have not yet, I highly recommend checking out the Wikipedia page for the full story. The army, in turn, believes they are being managed by incompetent thieves, who are only interested in profiting from military contracts. Therefore, the soldiers carry out orders with the intention of getting something for themselves and avoiding punishment. To understand the dynamic of the Russian army, remember this formula. Strategic initiatives are devised at the top with little regard for how they will be implemented. These orders are then passed down to cynical officers who do not trust their superiors. Resources are always in short supply because they are either stolen or misdirected. The soldiers on the ground are just trying to survive. As the war drags on, the army becomes increasingly entangled in war crimes. Military propaganda may try to portray the soldiers as heroes, but in the age of the internet, the truth eventually appears. Anyone who truly wants to know can easily find it. Though, of course, not everyone wants to. Intelligence often gets it wrong, and missiles don't hit military targets but civilian ones. The army is poorly trained, and it has a large number of psychopaths or people suffering from severe PTSD. The soldiers' nerves are short, and they resort to looting, drinking, and venting their frustrations on the locals. As a result, the war becomes one long string of criminal acts. These actions are never punished because if investigations were to start, the higher-ups might be implicated. These are the people with connections, power, and influence, and they will protect their positions at all costs. Those who seek justice are the only ones who will be punished, and everyone knows this. War crimes are not just limited to Ukrainians. The system also chews up its own people. I've made a separate video on why Russian soldiers are willing to go on suicide missions. Check it out. It explains a lot. This army can only function under one condition: unlimited supplies of money and people. All its mistakes are covered up with money and human losses. On the moral side of things, I believe most Russian soldiers feel no guilt towards Ukrainians. They have witnessed the brutal deaths of their comrades, mutilated bodies, severed limbs, and corpses crushed by tanks. Such horrors strip away any sense of sympathy. When death is something you see every day, it warps your sense of morality entirely. But people in the rear understand all of this. They may claim to be patriotic, but they are fearful of those who kill others just like them. People living in the same type of apartment buildings, speaking the same language since all of eastern Ukraine speaks Russian, and looking exactly the same. The Russian army was not prepared for a real war. Yes, in 2020, there were large-scale exercises along the border with Ukraine and in Crimea, but everyone thought these were just routine maneuvers, where soldiers would march in fields for 3 weeks and then go back home to scrape off the mud and recover from bronchitis. Ukrainians knew an invasion was coming, but even high-ranking officers in the Russian general staff did not truly believe it. The reason for this is that key decisions in Russia's foreign policy are made by the president, and he rarely consults his subordinates or takes their opinions into consideration. In 2022, it seems like Ukraine could not possibly win against Russia. After all, Crimea and Donbass were occupied in 2014 almost without resistance. Everything was based on the assumption that Ukrainians would be intimidated into signing the necessary agreements with Putin. As a result, the army suffered a series of defeats and many officers and soldiers simply perished. They were the first to go to the front lines, and statistically, they had fewer chances of survival than those who arrived later. When the Russian army began to run out of soldiers due to the heavy casualties, there was an urgent need for reinforcements. That's when the notorious entrepreneur Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of Vladimir Putin, who previously worked with mercenary armies in Africa and Syria, suggested to Putin that they recruit prisoners. If they signed contracts, their criminal records would be erased. Essentially, if you had committed a crime, you could wipe the slate clean by joining the army. However, the human resource in Russian prisons also proved to be limited. Prisons don't produce good soldiers. They produce poorly socialized, undisciplined individuals with severe mental health issues, often compounded by poor health. Prison does not transform people into muscular, tattooed studs as movie would suggest. Here's a clear example of what happens to a person in prison. This is opposition leader Alexei Navalny before the arrest, and this is after several months in a Russian camp. It's clear that the losses among the prisoners recruited into the army will be high, and something needed to be done about that. Putin's initial vision was that the Russian people, united by a common cause, would eagerly enlist to fight the war he had initiated. He likely imagined a scene similar to 1941, when millions of young men and women volunteered to fight the Nazis, rallying to the anthem "Arise, Great Country." But this time, the situation was different. It wasn't Russia who was attacked. They were the ones who started the war. Ukraine is a very close, kindred nation, and many Russians have relatives and friends there. After World War II, the primary slogan in the USSR was "As long as there's no war." The devastation of the war and the immense loss of life left Russians with one simple desire: to never see such a tragedy repeated. Yet, here we are. Putin attempted to mobilize the population, but it backfired. His approval ratings plummeted immediately. While some conscripts were still called up, the authorities deliberately avoided mobilizing people from large cities, fearing public unrest. Instead, they focused on small towns and villages. A friend of mine, Olga, who lived in one of those small towns, told me how it unfolded. The town's main factory, the one that the entire local economy depended on, was ordered to send a certain number of workers to the army. The factory management decided to select people they wouldn't mind losing: laborers, warehouse workers, and those without specific skills. Olga shared how her husband, who also worked at this factory, received the draft notice. He decided to go to the recruitment office, and before they knew it, he and his co-workers were packed into a bus, ready to be sent to war. These people were used to following orders. having worked their entire lives at one place without ever imagining something different. It never occurred to them to refuse. How could I not go? My friends are going, and I'm not. Am I a coward? Olga was a hairdresser, and her salon was where all the local officials got their haircuts. When she found out her husband was being taken, she used all her power, screaming, cursing, and threatening to call her important clients. Somehow, the officers listened, and her husband was released. With some savings, they managed to buy tickets to Mexico, and from there, they made it to the United States. That's how I met Olga and her husband. This is a typical story of a family that was doing well, working, raising children, and loving each other. But then the government barged in and told the husband, "You must go to war." The men who were sent on those buses eventually made their way to the front lines, and many didn't survive. Olga knew many of them because in such a small town everyone knows each other. There were a lot of casualties, and two of her cousins, also conscripted, died. Keep in mind that conscripts are just regular people like anyone else. They might be more vulnerable and less educated, and that is why they didn't refuse when called. They could have said no, but they didn't. Those who understood Russian history and how the Russian state works fled the country in droves, leaving a significant gap in the workforce, as these people had the skills, knowledge, and resources the country desperately needed. So the idea of mass mobilization was eventually abandoned. The political leadership started looking for alternative sources of cannon fodder. They decided to buy the soldiers for their war games, kind of like how you can pay for reinforce your powers in a video game. This is how the Russian army recruited its contract soldiers. Typically, these are men from disadvantaged families who, for various reasons, see military service as their only chance to rise above their circumstances, earn money, and improve their social standing. Sometimes wives pressure their husbands, who may struggle with alcoholism or unemployment, to sign a contract, telling them, "You are not a man if you don't go. At least do something useful for the country and for the family." Then there are the desperate ones, like a man who joins the army after his wife cheats on him, thinking, "If I die, she'll regret it." No matter the outcome, those who survive expect to return with a higher social status. They believe they'll have money, military pensions, and, as the propaganda constantly tells them, they will become part of the new elite. And of course, they expect the country to recognize them as heroes for shedding blood in the name of the state. However, public reception of returning soldiers has become increasingly negative. Prigozhin promised prisoners that if they fought for several months, they would be released. While he was alive, this promise was honored. The volunteers and conscripts were not allowed to return home, while the criminals were. Once they got back, they reverted to their old behaviors. There are constant reports of these heroes committing crimes: rape, arson, fights, and even murders. Since the criminals were the first to return, they set the tone for how all returning soldiers are perceived. In Russia, returning soldiers are now often associated with criminals, fueling fear and anxiety about what will happen when more heroes come back, many of them with post-traumatic stress disorder. We're already seeing frequent incidents where veterans are either denied entry to cafes and shops or even beaten and mocked. The nationalist segment of the Russian internet is boiling with anger. They want to see Russia continue to fight and win, and they expect public support for the war. But this is not happening. While it's widely understood that those who went to war are essentially mercenaries, Nationalists attempt to reshape the narrative, claiming that the volunteers are defending the motherland and that the state is paying them because Russians don't abandon their own. But the reality is that there is a severe shortage of soldiers, and the large salaries are being offered because soldiers are refusing to fight for less. Many idealistic nationalists eager to fight for Mother Russia enlisted in the early months of the war. By now, most of them are dead. It turned out there are plenty of older, die-hard pro-war individuals, but not enough young, fit men willing to risk their lives. The general landscape in Russian cities is like this. The officials are just doing what they think their superiors want. That's how both repression and propaganda work. But the goal here is not the greatness of Russia or Putin. It's about keeping themselves safe and pleasing the top brass. The vast majority prefer to live their normal lives while they still can. Escapism is a key strategy. This escapism manifests in two ways. Some people start believing the narrative the state media is feeding them. That the war is a fight against fascism, that Russia is on the side of good versus evil. It's a convenient position. It aligns you with their authorities, and you are safe from this perspective. Plus, you, by definition, don't believe the Russian army commits any crimes in Ukraine. It just doesn't exist. It feels nice. Others completely disengage from the war. They stop reading about it, avoid talking about it, and remain uninformed. As long as nothing directly affects their lives, they continue to live in their own bubble. No one wants to see what's really happening. No one wants to sacrifice or show enthusiasm, and it's obvious that when the mobilized soldiers return to the cities, nobody will be too happy to see them, as they will bring aggression, demands, and problems with them. Now, let's take a look at how the Russian government perceives the war veterans. The authorities are deeply concerned about letting these soldiers return because they could potentially challenge the existing power dynamics and spark social unrest. Even if they don't have any specific political demands, this could still pose a threat. The government is aware that those returning from the front lines could turn into opposition figures and bring about significant change in Russia. Historically, we've seen something similar in 1914. Tsar Nicholas II sent millions of soldiers to fight in World War I. The reason for the war was unclear to them. Was it for new territories? Russia already had enough land. Millions died, the economy collapsed, and the real problem arose when these soldiers began to desert. They returned to the major cities and seized power. It's important to understand that the Russian Revolution of 1917 was not solely led by the Bolsheviks. They were a small political party, and the majority of the population was not familiar with their ideology due to widespread illiteracy. The Bolsheviks simply promised not to punish deserters, which is why these soldiers and sailors sided with them. The story is explained in detail in my novel Russian Treasures, which captures the step-by-step process of one of the most significant events of the 20th century, a revolution that not only changed Russia, but the entire world. While the current situation may resemble events from a century ago, there are still notable differences. For one, the soldiers returning from the front are not in the millions. They are likely to be reintegrated gradually. The government will either keep them on contract or resettle them in new territories, assigning them jobs in military bases. The goal is to keep them occupied and ensure they continue receiving salaries. Even if some return to cities, they will mostly go back to small towns or villages in poorer areas where they came from. And for the Kremlin, it doesn't really matter if they are unhappy or want something more. Putin and the country's leadership have promised the soldiers that they will be the new elite. However, in reality, no one is eager to give them power. Bureaucrats are fiercely competing for control over budgets and resources, and this is how large careers and businesses are built, both in Moscow and the provinces. If the Kremlin decides that soldiers returning from the front lines should replace current officials, the bureaucracy will resist. Russian bureaucracy is highly resourceful, and they've come up with two interesting strategies. The first is to portray themselves as war heroes. Officials sign up for special units, stay in frontline zones but safely out of harm's way, take photos in new uniforms, and then return to declare, I'm a veteran. In reality, these individuals were already part of the bureaucratic structure and they used their new veteran status as a tool to gain promotions. The second strategy is to take real veterans, those who weren't previously officials, and appoint them to symbolic positions. For example, they might become deputy mayors for the social protection of other war veterans. They can meet, drink vodka, complain about their experiences, sing songs, and reminisce about the war. These positions won't offer any real power, influence, or access to resources. It's all just for show, pure propaganda. This mirrors the late Soviet Union, where World War II veterans were celebrated publicly but lived in a communal apartment and in abject poverty. We can imagine how this will unfold. If Putin stays in power, these veterans will be scattered, bought off, or, if they've been severely wounded, hidden away in obscurity. There's a historical precedent for this. After World War II, disabled veterans who returned home marred the image of socialism, and the state had to do something about it. They were simply rounded up and sent to former monasteries, essentially hospice like places where they lived out their lives without limbs, without eyes, and without proper care. I suspect a similar fate awaits those returning from this war, especially those who are badly wounded. The government will want to forget this shameful conflict as quickly as possible. If this video provided value for you, please consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. If you'd like to support my work directly, you can click the join button, give a super thanks, or buy me a coffee using the link below. Every bit of support means a lot to me. I am grateful to have you here.